The babysitter's last text. Who's upstairs? The text came at 9:58 on a wet Friday in early November, the screen lighting the dim kitchen of a craftsman house on Maple Ridge Avenue in the town of Larkspur, Pennsylvania. The babysitter had written only 3 words, spaced as if she had to force her thumbs to move. Who's upstairs? Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Her name was Ione Kestrel, a college sophomore who took evening jobs to pay for studio art supplies and a public transit pass to the city. She was a quiet soul with a quick wit, the kind of person who noticed the way rain made halos around streetlights and the way children's laughter changed when they grew tired. 2 kids slept under that roof that night, a 6-year-old boy named Briar and his 3-year-old sister named Lark. Their parents, Rowan and Maeve Harrow, had left at 7:15 for an anniversary dinner at a restaurant by the river. The year, if you need to understand the way phones hummed and doorbell cameras watched, was 2019. The house at 42 Maple Ridge was one of those old American stories, built in wood and memory, a deep porch with a swing that complained just enough to be charming, oak floors that spoke out loud when the humidity changed, crown molding thick as a picture frame. At the back, a narrow staircase rose from the mudroom to a short landing, and then up again into the second floor where the bedrooms sat in a row like well-behaved children. At the top of the main stairs, there was a crawl space door that had once led to a linen closet and now led to a barely insulated wedge of attic, hot in summer and sharp with cold in winter, the kind of door that makes a welcome thud when it closes and an unwelcome thud when it doesn't. Before the Harrows left, they did all the small, loving rituals. Maeve set out a plate of sliced apples, a bowl of popcorn, and a note that read, "Help yourself to anything except the scotch." Rowan pointed to the thermostat and said the heat pumps kick on if the temperature dips. Fancy house, but the bones are stubborn. He smiled at Ione in the doorway, hair damp from the drizzle, denim jacket dotted with rain. Text us if the storm knocks the power out. Text us if the kids wake and ask for the song about the lighthouse. Text us even if you think it'll make us look overprotective. It won't. At 7:30, the children were bathed, pajamaed, and nestled into beds that smelled faintly of line-dried sheets. Ione read the lighthouse song twice, and the little girl fell asleep with a hand on the brother's shoulder, a tether strong enough to hold a moon in place. At 8, the dishwasher hummed its modest lullaby. At 8:20, the rain came harder, dropping like a handful of pebbles thrown by a polite intruder. At 8:42, the doorbell camera pinged, announcing a raccoon with ambitions. Ione's phone ticked with messages from a group chat, small bursts of jokes and memes. She answered 2 and then set the phone face down, because she had promised herself she would be the kind of sitter who watched and listened. She put a kettle on. She chose a mug with a hairline crack because hairline cracks reminded her of river maps. She stood at the back window and watched the alley, where a single streetlight blew a cone of yellow onto the wet blacktop like a candle someone had forgotten to snuff. At 9:21, a floorboard spoke upstairs. It was not the sound of a child rolling over and not the polite pop of wood releasing humidity. It was a stepped-on sound, slow and weight-bearing, forward and then a tiny, deliberate back. Ione took one breath, then another. The kettle clicked off. The house returned to its normal choir. She checked the baby monitor screen. 2 small forms slept. The greenish night vision painting dreams onto their faces. She told herself she knew old houses. She told herself wind can make timber say things it doesn't mean. At 9:36, the sound came again, above the kitchen this time, in the hallway between the children's rooms. One step and another. A long pause. Then the faintest scrape, as if someone had scuffed a shoe and then, embarrassed by the sound, tried to rub it out with the sole. The kind of scrape that turns the air thin. Ione lifted the house phone from its cradle because old houses carry old phones like relics. No dial tone because this was 2019 and the landline was a costume. She put it back and picked up her cell. No missed call, no alert from the doorbell camera. She opened the parent's contact, hovered, did not press. First, she would look, she would be careful. She would not give Rowan and Maeve a reason to race home on wet roads unless there was a reason. She climbed the back stairs because they felt less like a stage. Each step was shallow and careful. The rain softened to a hiss. Her breath became a guest she had to host with manners. At the landing, the air grew cooler. She could see down the short hall into the little boy's room, the lighthouse nightlight casting a steerable arc of white. She could see the girl's room door nearly closed, just enough to make a crescent, the way some children like it. She could also see the crawlspace door at the top of the main stairs. It was closed, latch turned. That mattered more than it should have. She waited. Sometimes the house wants to know if you have patience. Sometimes it will reward you with silence. Sometimes it will not. There was a third sound, not a footfall this time, but a breath. Not hers. Not a child's soft, open-mouth exhale, but the kind of breath that pauses at the end like it is tasting the air. It came from the darkness beyond the crawlspace door, except the door was shut. Ione felt the tiny hairs along her forearms confess themselves to fear. She stepped into the boy's room. He slept with his mouth open just a little, lower lip shiny. Good. She stepped to the girl's room. Little Lark had turned onto her stomach, stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Good. When Ione moved back into the hall, her eyes caught something at the far end where the light thinned. A strand of damp hair lay across the floorboards, faint as a pencil mark, a single narrow ribbon that did not belong to either child. It glistened. She knelt without thinking and picked it up. Cold. Clean. Long enough to belong to someone grown. She stood up too quickly and steadied herself with a hand on the wall. Her palm pressed into a nail head that had been painted over and sanded down so smooth it felt like a coin. She thought the oddest thought then. If I press that nail in, will the crawlspace door open by itself? She smiled at herself because fear makes even introverts dramatic in their own skulls. She returned to the back stairs, slow and exact, and only when she reached the fourth step from the bottom did she glance at her phone. The time read 9:58. The text she sent herself, as if letting the words exist outside her head could make them smaller, was only 3 words. Who's upstairs? She meant to send it to Rowan. She meant to send it to Maeve. She meant the message as a half-joke with a serious underlayer. But the thumb that had learned to move fast learned the wrong dance. It went to her friend in the group chat, and by the time she realized, the message had already become a tiny flare in half a dozen pockets around town. Her friend replied with, "What are you doing?" and also joking, right? And also put them on speaker. Ione did not reply. She set the phone on the counter face up this time. She took the largest knife from the drawer and then immediately put it back because knives are not courage and courage is not noise. She chose instead a heavy flashlight from the mudroom shelf, the kind that doubles as a hammer. She clicked it on. The beam carved a clean white tunnel along the baseboards. She moved to the bottom of the main staircase now, because if fear wants you to circle, wisdom wants you to cross. The newel post was worn as a handshake. Family photographs climbed the wall. A wedding photograph near the bottom showed Rowan in a blue suit and Maeve in a dress with sleeves that looked like light. Higher up, a picture of Briar in a lion costume, nap-flattened mane, grinning with the sincerity only a 6-year-old can manage. Above that, near the top, a framed landscape. The glass reflected the flashlight beam like a lid. Halfway up, she paused. There was that breath again. Not a cough, not a snore. A breath like someone who had been holding still too long and had to remind their body to keep doing the automatic things. The sound came from beyond the last step, in the shadow to the left, where the crawlspace door Saturday. It was closed, latch turned. She aimed the beam at the brass. The metal showed a fog that had not been there a minute ago, condensation, from a mouth that had exhaled near it. She kept her own mouth shut because you cannot take breath back once it is out. The latch moved. It moved too gently to be gravity. It made the tiniest metal-on-metal sigh. Then it stilled, as if the person behind the door had realized they had announced themselves and decided to pretend nothing had happened at all. Ione's voice, when it came, was not loud. It was firm in the way a music teacher's voice is firm when she asks a child to stop tapping the desk with a pencil. I'm a babysitter. The police are on their way. If you are a neighbor who has made a mistake, this is your chance to leave without me seeing your face. If you are not a neighbor, this is your chance to decide to be one. Nothing moved. But the house did a small thing then. It clicked. A sound traveled through the baseboards from kitchen to parlor like a cricket chirp. The refrigerator compressor had kicked on. The world had not narrowed to only this door. She stepped higher. She brought the beam closer to the latch. She did not touch it. She watched a drop of moisture on the brass slide very slowly toward the handle and then stop, held by a force that did not want to be named. From the children's rooms, nothing. From outside, rain. From down the hall, a draft like someone had opened a mouth to speak and then decided not to. She took the phone, thumb shaking now not from drama, but from the body's strange understanding of scales. She typed 911 and the call went through on the first chime. The dispatcher answered with a first name and a county. Ione told that calm voice her name, the address, the fact of 2 sleeping children, the fact of a locked door with breath behind it that did not belong to the family. The voice said, "Officers are on the way." The voice said, "Stay on the line." The voice said, "Do not open the door." So she did not. She watched it the way you watch a stage when you know the performer is already in the wings. She told the dispatcher every small thing she saw. The latch is fogged. The brass is pitted near the screw head. The paint around the jamb is chipped the way it chips when someone tries to open a door with a butter knife. The dispatcher asked about the kids, and she told her about the lighthouse song because sometimes the answer to a safety question is a story that proves you are paying attention. It took 6 minutes for the first cruiser to roll into the alley, though those 6 minutes ran long like string you cannot find the end of. 2 officers climbed the porch steps, rang the bell softly out of habit, then tried the knob and announced themselves. Ione walked down the main stairs, not taking her eyes from the crawlspace door, unlatched the front door, and stepped back quickly so the officers could enter. Their names were Officer Tamsin Dupre and Officer Hal Moran. They were young enough to still wear the job like a coat borrowed from a bigger relative, and old enough to know when to keep their weapons holstered because children were sleeping. Ione pointed. The hall was framed now by their bodies and the yellow hallway light and the cleaner light of the flashlight. Officer Dupre nodded, raised a hand to let silence accumulate, and then approached the door with a slowness that reminded Ione of a conductor raising a baton before the first downbeat. Dupre put 2 fingers lightly on the latch and did not move it. She bent, eye to the thin seam between door and jamb. She inhaled. She did not exhale for a count of 3. Then she did, a controlled tide. She mouthed one word to Moran. There. Moran moved with that cop-slow speed that reads as kindness until it becomes a tackle. He positioned himself on the knob side. Dupre took the hinge side. They counted without sound. Moran turned the knob and pulled. The door did not open. Dupre drove her shoulder low into the panel, and the old wood decided to be new and gave with a crack that sounded like an ankle breaking far away. The space beyond was small, angled, cluttered, with things families save because they carry stories in them. A fan with no blade, a suitcase with travel stickers that meant Paris had existed once for someone in this house. 3 plastic bins of children's clothes marked in black marker, a broken chair that had not given up, and a person, folded into the angle between floor and pitch, knees under chin, face turned away from the light, hands empty and ready to lie about it. Dupre said, "Do not move." Moran said, "Show me your hands." The person did not show their hands. They lifted their left shoulder like someone about to stand in a narrow coffin, and then realized there was no way to both stand and not be seen. They kept their face turned. A smell came from the small hot space that was not attic smell. It was sweat and wool and rain and a cologne Ione could not name but would recognize for years in crowds and feel a short-lived lightening in her spine. The person finally shifted enough for the light to catch their cheekbone. Smooth, young, the jawline of someone who still believes they can sneak back to the version of themselves that did not make this choice. Dupree reached. The person flinched, then stilled. Moran took the wrists, quick. Plastic cuffs clicked, and Saturday. The person whispered one word so fast and so quiet, it sounded like a sound and not a word. Please. There are nights when a house rearranges what you know about it. There are nights when law and luck arrive at the same time and dress alike so you cannot tell who deserves the thank you. There are nights when children sleep through the loudest noises and wake to the softest ones. Breyer woke when Officer Dupre gently asked Ione if the boy had a favorite song she could sing while they stepped this stranger past his doorway and into a world that would be, for the stranger, smaller and heavier. Ione sang the lighthouse song, the boy rolled over, the girl sniffed twice, and then reclaimed her rabbit. The name given at the kitchen table later, with the cuffs off and the hands folded around a paper cup of tap water, was Corin Vale. He was 22, a barback at a music venue downtown, a part-time mover for a storage company on the edge of town, a person whose landlord had changed the lock that very afternoon because rent was late again, and who had wandered past the Harrow's house just after 9, watching rain stencil shadows on the porch. He said the front porch light was off, that the back alley light was the kind that made him nervous because it buzzed. He said he had once done a job in this very house, moving boxes after Maeve's mother passed, that he knew the crawlspace door did not always latch if you pushed too hard. He said all this in a way that sounded like memorized lines. Officer Moran left for a minute and returned with a small bag-tagged chain of custody. Inside, a multi-tool with a narrow flathead blade that would fit under a painted jam and lever it without much damage, a pair of cheap cotton gloves, damp, a folded postcard someone had intended to mail, featuring a lighthouse on the coast of Maine, and a note written in pencil that read, "We are well, love you, see you in December." The postcard had not been addressed yet. Corin looked at the lighthouse as if it had insulted him. "Why?" Officer Dupre asked. "Are you in a crawl space with a multi-tool?" Corin said he wanted to get out of the rain. He said he saw the back door wasn't fully latched. He said he knocked and no one answered. He said he stepped inside to be out of the weather. He said he heard children and then realized he had made a mistake and was trying to hide until he could unmake it. He said he had not gone near the bedrooms. He said he had not taken anything. He said most lies are just a breath away from the truth if you hold the breath long enough. The doorbell camera proved he had never rung. The back door, which Ione had locked after the raccoon, had not been forced, which meant the multi-tool had met the strike plate and learned a new way to talk. The thin condensation on the latch proved his face had been inches from the brass, as if he were listening through metal to weigh his chances. The damp hair on the hallway floor did not match Ione or the children. It matched Corin. The officers did not say poetry out loud, but sometimes evidence makes a poem whether or not you want it. Rowan and Maeve arrived at 10:28, windblown and wet, faces open with fear, and then with the specific relief parents make when they count the number of children and find the number unchanged. Maeve thanked Ione, then thanked Officer Dupre, then thanked the kettle for existing because it gave her hands something to do. Rowan walked to the base of the main stairs and looked up at the crawlspace door and put his hand on the newel post like a man greeting an old friend and apologized under his breath to the house for not knowing it needed him tonight. The rain slowed, the streetlight outside defined every leaf as if auditioning them for a brighter job. Corin Vale sat at the kitchen table and looked smaller and then larger and then smaller again, the way a person does when they realize they have chosen a story they cannot revise. He asked for a lawyer then, as was his right, and the night shifted into a new shape with paperwork and phone calls and the sound of zippers on evidence bags. Later, after the officers had gone and the house had been put back in order with all the rituals humans use to convince themselves the world is knowable, Rowan stood on the porch and stared at the street. A car hissed by, tires whispering on wet asphalt. Somewhere a train declared itself. He turned when Ione stepped onto the porch with 2 mugs of chamomile tea and the brittle, beautiful calm people make after the danger has taken its hands off their shoulders. He said thank you a dozen ways that did not use the word thank. She said, of course a dozen ways. That meant I am shaking on the inside, but I am still here. Maeve joined them, the porch light warming the edges of her hair, and the 3 of them stood in a small triangle like a warning sign no one else would read. When Maeve spoke, her voice had a new floor under it. We will change the locks. We will reinforce that door. We will move the postcard basket. We will install a sensor that turns on a light at the slightest motion. We will do the things that let us sleep. Ione nodded and did not say that sleep would come with its own sounds now. The sound of a breath behind a door. The sound of a latch fogging. The sound of a floorboard speaking the truth. There is a detail the police report will not mention, because police reports must make simple lines out of crooked knights. At 9:59, after sending the text to the wrong chat and before calling emergency services, Ione leaned her forehead against the cool plaster of the stairwell for the space of one heartbeat. She whispered something that was not quite a prayer and not quite a promise. Okay, if someone is up there, I will not be the person who opens the door and invites them in. I will be the person who names the danger out loud. Sometimes that is the whole difference. Not bravery that charges, but the steadiness that refuses to be tricked into being polite to danger. The next morning, the November sky tried on a bland blue and liked it. The town of Larkspur went back to the work of a Saturday. Kids in hoodies kicked at leaf piles. The bakery line wrapped twice around the counter. A woman in a gray coat standing by the river thought the water sounded like someone ripping silk very slowly and wondered who she would tell that to. Ione slept past noon and woke to a peanut butter text from Maeve, which read in that shaky grammar of gratitude, "Come by for dinner anytime. And also, I found your denim jacket on the porch swing. And also, there will be pie tonight if you want pie." She smiled and answered with too many thank yous and one yes to pie. She showered longer than she needed to, stood still in the water in a way that made time into a warm curtain, then dressed in gently clean clothes that smelled like detergent and a future. When she stepped outside, the air had that crisp, crisp edge. That means the first hard frost has already visited and left behind a postcard of itself on every windshield. Maple Ridge Avenue looked like an old movie taught to speak color. She walked past houses that had their curtains open a little wider than usual, past neighbors who held eye contact just a second longer, the way people do when the story has almost become a myth and they want to remind themselves it is still shaped like a person. On the Harrow's porch, there were new screws in the latch. The crawlspace door upstairs had a length of wood screwed diagonally across it like a stern eyebrow. A small motion sensor had been installed in the hall. It blinked a polite green and then went to sleep. The kids were in socks, sliding across the floor, laughing the laugh that children make the morning after a storm when the yard is new again. Rowan handed Ione a slice of apple pie on a paper plate and said again what he had said the night before, but with the daylight, making his voice warmer. You kept your head, you called, you stayed steady. That is the whole job sometimes. We will tell people that part when we tell them the story. Not who he was, not what he said, not the smell. We will tell them you named the danger and didn't let it decide your speed. The town told the story in its own ways. The newspaper, which had been saved from extinction by a stubborn editor named Lita Quinn, wrote a piece with the careful headline, "Babysitter's Quick Thinking Leads to Arrest in Overnight Burglary Attempt." The group chat learned, gently from Ione herself, that sometimes jokes congeal into myths, and myths can be mean. At the music venue, a bartender wiped the length of the bar 3 times, then once more, then stopped. At the storage company, a supervisor stared at a stack of moving blankets and tried to add up what the numbers meant about people. There is not a moral here, sharp and so clean it can cut bread. There is not an ending where everyone claps and the house resumes being only a house. There remains a door with a new diagonal board and screws that will loosen over time and be tightened again. There remains a boy who will ask, on a night 2 weeks later when rain drums the gutter, "Can you sing the lighthouse song one more time?" And a girl who will say, not the part where the foghorn sounds, that part sounds like a giant in the crawlspace. There remains a young man named Corin, whose first court date will arrive with a sky the exact color of the alley light, and who will have to decide whether to say the word sorry to the ceiling or to the faces in the room. At 9:58 on some future night, a phone will light in some other kitchen in some other town, and a person will type 3 words spaced out as if their thumbs had to be convinced. Who's upstairs? If you are that person, hear this story as a map of breath. Name the danger, make the call, keep your voice exactly as loud as it needs to be and no louder. Stand where you can see doors and hallways. Carry light. Remember that a latch that fogs is a sentence the house is trying to say. Let the sentence finish. If you are listening from a city, may the traffic outside be ordinary and honest. If you are listening from a farmhouse that knows every creek by its first name, May the wind be the only guest tonight. If you are listening in a small apartment where the neighbor's footsteps already live in your ceiling, may you learn the grammar of each tread so well that the first strange syllable tells you exactly what to do. The babysitter's last text was a question pointed upstairs, but the real end of the story is how she answered all the other questions pointed at her. Will you panic? Will you try to be polite when the moment calls for clear? Will you open a door because silence asked sweetly? She chose no, no, and no. She chose the shape of a steady voice on a thin line. She chose to be the reason the house could go back to being only wood and memory. Some nights, when she passes the Harrows by chance and the porch swing is still, she hears only the rain and the river, and that is enough. Some nights, she hears the old door upstairs settle as the heat kicks on and thinks, with a small smile, that even a house can be taught to breathe more quietly. And on the better nights, every window along Maple Ridge holds a square of light cut, perfect as a fresh slice of pie, and the street keeps its watch, and the children sleep so deep the world could rewrite its rules, and they would wake to the new rules fresh and ready to be memorized. If that happens where you are, tell me when. Tell me what the air smells like. Tell me the hour, spoken slowly so the world cannot run away with it. Tell me if the latch on your upstairs door is dry and dull or a little fogged from someone's breath. Tell me if you are holding a mug with a hairline crack that looks like a river map. Tell me if the house has taught you any of its words. And if your phone lights at 9:58 and the message reads as simple and terrible as a knock, remember the kitchen in Larkspur and the steady girl in the denim jacket, and say out loud to no one and to everyone, not tonight, not on my watch, not in this house. He followed the whistling into the cornfield. He told himself it was wind in the stalks, nothing more. But the sound had shape, and it carried a tune the way a bottle carries a ship. It rose up from the edge of the north field just before midnight, thin and certain, 3 notes first, then a run, then a pause, that felt like a person making room for breath. The night in Story County, Iowa, was the kind that makes a kitchen window into a mirror. He stood with one hand on the sill, the other around a chipped mug, and the whistling kept at it, unafraid to be heard. Before we begin, tell me where are you listening from and what time is it there? This was late September 2015. The day had been warm, sky rinsed clean after a brief storm, gravel roads drying into their usual rattle. The farm sat a mile and a half south of Nevada, east of the Skunk River, where it hooks like a lazy elbow. The corn had gone that heavy, dull gold that means the grain is ready and the husks are sick of holding on. In the house, the bedside clock down the hall said 11:52. On the porch, a moth bumped the bulb, reconsidered, bumped again. Merritt Dow listened and felt his scalp move, the way skin does when a memory gets up and looks at you. He had heard whistling most of his life, but not like this. His father had been a whistler when he repaired the sickle bar, when he checked the tension on the auger belts. His grandfather, too, walking the rows with a plug of tobacco and a tune older than the tractor. Merritt could place a tune by county if you gave him a night and a jar of iced tea. This one, though it didn't belong to any porch or station wagon, it had the small brightness of a fairground and the old soul of a hymn, mixed wrong on purpose and still somehow right. He set the mug down, pulled on his boots without bothering with the laces, and stepped into the porch light. The whistling came again, 3 notes that stepped down like someone walking off a train. He clicked off the switch. The yard went honest. The gravel drive was a gray river. The corn made its tinny rain sound whenever the breeze remembered its job. To the north, the trees along the fence line held their breath. Merritt had a habit of heading toward curiosity as if it were a calf out past the fence that needed fetching. He took the flashlight from the hook, the heavy kind with a rubber grip, and checked the batteries the way a person checks their pulse. He told himself this was neighbor trouble, or a kid from town testing bravery on a Friday dare. He told himself this was what the night does to grown men when sleep holds them by the elbow and then lets go. He told Dinah, the old collie, to stay. She licked once, turned in a tight circle on the porch rug, and stayed. He crossed the yard, past the big maple that had survived lightning by pretending it hadn't happened, and stepped onto the headland by the north field. The first row took him in like a store's door chime. The stalks were tall and dry, leaves bent into knives. The ground was soft from last week's rain and held his boot prints as if for reference. He waited for the whistling. It came from farther in now, or the rows had changed the way sound bends when it's forced to choose a path. He chose a path. He took row 18, the one that ran with the slight slope and the way water teaches roots to drink. His father had run the planter careful this spring, GPS straight when the signal behaved, by eye when it didn't. Row 18 should have held like a rail, the stalks pressed against his sleeves. The flashlight beam drew clean wood into the dark leaves, bleaching white, silk like old hair, dirt a puzzle of last year's husks, and this year's pennies of mud. The whistling stopped. He stood still. His breath sounded like someone else's in the mask of leaves. He tasted dust. He listened until listening felt like a rope he had to keep from dropping. Farther north, down toward the low spot by the drainage tile, it started again, only louder, as if the person had turned their head and decided the audience was worth the effort. Merritt moved. 3 rows over, the tram line cut across, a packed strip where the sprayer had gone in June. He took it. The corn arched overhead, leaves flicking his ears. Spiders had slung long theories between stalks. He broke them and apologized in his head. He had walked this ground every day for months, and the ground had said yes like a friend. Tonight, it felt like a cousin, a person who loves you without being sure what to do with you. He reached the low spot. The field dipped and turned its face toward the tile that ran down to the ditch. The air was cooler here, lined with the smell of black earth that keeps secrets for centuries, because that's what it was paid to do. The whistling had gone softer. A trill rose up like someone trying to make light of an apology. Merritt swept the flashlight sideways. The beam caught the blue reflection of something small and glassy. He crouched. A marble. Blue, with a pale ribbon curled inside, half under a leaf. He touched it with one finger and felt the way glass feels when it learned patience waiting inside a pocket for its chance. He stood, and the beam hit another, green this time, lodged at the foot of a stalk. He put them both in his shirt pocket without thinking which pocket meant past and which meant present. "Hello," he said. The field appreciated the effort, if the small answering hush meant anything. He wasn't the kind of man who called out names into a place that did not have names to call back. He was the kind of man who waited and then took one more step, the way you do with cattle that have decided the gate is optional. He took one more step. The ground had a memory. His boots sank an inch, then 2. He pulled up. The mud let go with a sound like a low laugh. The beam found a scuff in the soil that wasn't his. It had rained the day before, a polite rain that brightened the world and left. Tracks should be fresh. This mark had a sharpness to it he didn't like. He aimed the light again. The scuff came to a point. Not deer, not raccoon. A toe of a boot slid sideways and corrected because the body above that boot had decided to remain upright. The field held that story and did not mind telling it. The whistling kept on. It moved east. Merritt moved too, allowing the rows to push him into the old waterway nobody planted because it cost more to argue with a ditch than to go around. He hit the bank and paused. The sound was close enough now to feel the mouth that made it. The slight wet at the end of notes, the breath through teeth. Above the ditch, on the fence line, a scarecrow leaned into the moon like he had been invited. Merritt had dressed him in a flannel shirt in July to keep the birds from laughing outright. Now the shirt's checks looked like an argument. The hat had blown off sometime in August. The stake had a twist in it the way wood does when it was alive and insists on a personality after. The scarecrow whistled. Merritt's body did not move in the way of cartoon men. He did not jump. He did not fling the light so hard the beam went to the stars. He stood, the way a person stands when what he sees insists on being nothing but what it is. He put the light on the scarecrow's painted mouth. The paint was flaked, the smile wrong on purpose. His father's old gloves were nailed to the crosspiece, fingers bent into permanent work. The straw at the neck had learned the shape of wind and refused to unlearn it. The tune came again from behind the scarecrow, clipped by fence wire and field. He played the beam along the fence. This line had been his grandfather's. His father had repaired it across 3 winters, one staple at a time, using a hammer that had bent 100 nails and 100 more. Tonight, a single strand lay loose between posts, a neat cut at shin height made by someone who liked clean work. Beyond the fence, the other place. Neighbors in the country are closer than people in town and farther away. The acreage to the east had belonged to the Kesslers once, then to the bank, then to a man who installed irrigation pivots with a speed that made the county whisper. Then it's Saturday. The pivot circle kept a gargoyle symmetry in the daylight and turned to bones at night. The whistling came from inside that circle, not far, an invitation or a dare. Merritt climbed the fence by habit and dropped into the tall, ragged grass beyond. His flashlight skipped over metal. The pivot tower rose where the corn had been cut early for silage. A ladder led up to a catwalk that had not been used since a summer of drought and cheap diesel. The sky put someone else's stars over everything. Under the ladder sat a cooler the color of a toy, lid askew, ice melted into a cold thought. 2 bottles lay on their sides. The labels had lost interest in staying on. He touched one. The glass was warm, warmer than the air deserved. He called out again, a different word this time. Friend. The whistling answered with the same run of notes. He followed the sound around the base of the pivot. His light found Cobb's nod down to the spindle by raccoons with principle. He found a folding chair with only 3 of its 4 screws willing. He found a playing card gone into the dirt, face down forever. He did not find a person. The corn from the other side rustled, a polite cough. He turned. A taller shadow leaned out from where 2 rows had been pushed apart. The flashlight found denim, boots, the hem of a coat cut square. A hand. The skin had the tint of rural men, year-round, sun-washed, wind-scoured. The fingers were long and still. The hand did not wave. Evening, Merritt said. He stepped closer. The shadow stepped back. The hand slid into the rows, as if hiding from a photograph. The whistling receded down an aisle of stalks, clean and straight as a hallway. He went after it. Later, he would say he never chose to follow, and he would not count that as a lie. The rows insisted. The sound invited. The night did what it always does when a person leaves a safe light and enters a place built to fit bodies only one at a time. It made a mouth and decided whether to swallow or to speak. The field spoke directions in leaves. He followed until the path tried to teach him regret, and his feet refused to be taught. At the heart of the pivot circle, the ground sank another foot. He stumbled once, caught himself against a stalk so dry it cut his palm in a clean straight line. He swore, quietly, with vowels only. The whistling had slowed. It drew out a single note and hung it in the air as if asking him to name it. He named it Unkind. He turned off the flashlight. Dark held him like water does when you slide under and open your eyes. The field went black, then not. The sky had its thin light, the stars arranged their patient omissions. The rows were no longer alleyways, exactly. They were sentences. A breeze moved through and added commas. He stepped forward into a word, then another. The whistling stopped. He waited. He could hear the pivot tower creak, a metal thought adjusting. A truck moved way off on County 18, 3 miles at least. Tires with thick voices, a man's radio too loud in the cab because the night drives its price down for everyone. He waited until the waiting was its own problem. He reached for the flashlight. The beam hit denim again. Close. A shoulder. He yanked the light up and met a face. It was not a face he knew from today. It might have been a face from a photograph under glass at the county fair, past names, eyes poured in. The hat was the wrong cut for now and the right cut for when hats were more than hats. The eyes adjusted to light with the slow patience of a barn cat in a doorway. The mouth held a shape that wasn't a smile and wasn't what comes later. The cheeks were hollowed in, the way working men's cheeks sag when they finally let the day have them. Don't, the man said, not loud. He lifted one finger the way a teacher does when she'd rather not get stern. Don't shine. Merritt lowered the beam to the man's chest. The denim had a tag that read, Kessler in faded thread, as if a mother had stitched it when mud was the usual weather. The man nodded, brief. He put 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled the run again. The note slid under the leaves and came back altered by straw and distance. Had to see if you'd come, the man said. He did not offer his name. He did not ask merits. The field did the introductions it believed in. The man tipped his chin toward the north, where the ditch had cut a new curve 2 springs ago, and nobody called the county because sometimes you let water take responsibility for its own choices. Come on, then. They went up Row, across the tram line, down again. Merritt kept the light aimed at boots and dirt the way you aim swear words when children are sleeping in the next room. The man's hands brushed the tassels as he went, leaving no sound. The field learned him and forgot Merritt in the same breath. They crossed into the neighbor's back 40, and the soil changed, darker and more confident. The rows had more to say here. The whistling would come and go like a small animal, checking the air and disliking it. The man stopped at a patch where the stalks had been storm-bent and then righted themselves out of pride. He crouched, hand out, palm down, on top of a flat stone that had no business on this ground. The stone was square. It held an iron ring in one corner. He tapped it. The sound returned like a jar lid. Used to be a storm door, he said. For the root cellar. They built the house up there. He flicked his eyes toward where the stars thinned and the silhouette of a ruined chimney picked its teeth on the horizon. Tornado took it in '54, you know that. Merritt nodded. He had heard the story. The county leaned on that year. It changed the way people believe in roofs. 3 days after, the man said, setting his palm to the stone like a pledge, "My brother thought he heard whistling here. We believed him because he was the kind of boy who told the truth, even when it meant he had to walk back and fix something. He followed it. Everybody followed it. Men with boots and women with cakes and ropes and tubs and a feeling of the back of their necks being breathed on. We pulled the stone up. We brought lanterns. It goes under like a snake down there. The cellar does. We didn't find anyone. No boy, no breath, just apples rolling because that's what they do when people die. Things keep their job anyway. We closed it back up. Weather put a shoulder on it. And now," he stopped. The whistling came, this time from under their feet. It rose up through the stone like a trick, thin and mean and a little proud, a tune that went square, then wandered off the edge. The iron ring shook against its socket with a burr. Merritt felt the hair along his forearms ask for a vote. "Now," the man said, "it calls people here when it's time." He put his hand on the ring. "I'm tired of it calling people here who are not me." He lifted. It did not rise much. The hinge had rusted itself into religion. The man looked at Merritt, not pleading, exactly, not persuading. He looked like a person offering you the end of a sentence the world has been running too long. Merritt set the flashlight down on its base and got his fingers under the corner. The stone was heavy-hearted, more weight than mass, the kind of weight that comes from being asked to hold back a story. They lifted together. It rose an inch, then 2. It settled on a ridge of broken brick. The smell answered before the dark did. Apples, old and bitter, work that had gone on without supervision. Cold earth that had kept promises by crushing them. A draft moved across Merritt's knuckles. It took his body down a list to be sure each part remembered what stand means. The whistling ran up inside the gap and out. It had volume now. It wished it had a throat. It would have stopped if someone had blessed the night right then and said, "Go on to sleep." No one blessed the night. Merritt and the man held the stone a second longer, then eased it down onto a stick propped like a tired knee. The gap held. The dark inside threw itself at their eyes and bounced back, patient. They did not aim the flashlight in, the man would not have it, and Merritt knew enough to trust someone who belonged to a place this much. They listened instead. The whistling ran its tune twice, then twice again, and each time the final note sagged, as if asking someone to let it lie. "Why me?" Merritt asked. He wasn't offended by the question. He wanted a reason that could wear a hat. "You were the one who heard it honest," the man said. "You stayed at the edge of your field as long as you could and still came. Some men run because they want a story to tell about themselves. You came because you wanted to know who to go fetch." Merritt shoved down the part of himself that softened at that. He bent, slid his hand into the gap until his fingertips touched the dirt at the lip. It was cool, the way a basement never loses January. He searched by hand, careful for glass, nothing but pebbles and the slow grind of last century's lessons. The whistling faltered. It shortened itself and became 3 notes, those 3 notes he had heard at the kitchen window, the 3 his father had bent into the radio between ballgame innings, the 3 his grandfather had used to call a dog that never needed calling. He withdrew his hand and stood. The man had his head down, listening as if his bones were the receiving equipment. He began to hum, not the tune, but a harmony low and uninsistent. The whistling slowed. The cellar air came up wetter than before, fouled for a second by something like breath, and then clean. The whistling stopped. They waited a full minute, then another. Merritt counted, slow, as if a child in a tent had asked him to promise monsters were on vacation. The ground under the stone was a fact again. The man let his harmony stop, the notes settling like a bird on a line, and then choosing not to stay. He knelt and pulled the stick, and the stone met its ledge with a sound like a chest closing. Sometimes, the man said into the calm, it wanted an argument. Sometimes it wanted somebody from back then to say his name and make a promise. It wanted a mother crying on the dirt. It wanted men with rope because rope makes everyone feel helpful. Not tonight. Tonight you came and you didn't carry any of that. You just listened harder than the field wants you to. That's enough. They stood together in the rows until the night got bored with them and went to do what the night does in other places. The pivot sighed and remembered it had bearings, not opinions. The ditch water moved on its way, not fast, not slow, never wrong. A coyote put a sentence into the air and another answered, and both sentences agreed to end where they did. The man tipped the brim of a hat he wasn't wearing and turned back into the corn. His boots made no more sound than a thought that knows its limit. Merritt found his way to his own side of the fence. The cut strand had not healed. Fences need hands. He climbed and dropped into dirt he had paid for with 3.5 decades of rain and frugal Sundays. The scarecrow leaned the same way. His flashlight picked out a nail that had worked proud where a glove met wood. He tapped it back in with the handle, the small sound a hope. On the porch, Dinah lifted her head and thumped her tail twice. He sat on the steps and watched the sky unspool its last thin silk. The clock over the stove in the kitchen read 1:42. A local freight passed through town without asking anyone's opinion. The night had its usual old chair smell. Merritt took the marbles from his pocket and rolled them in his palm. He did not take them in the house. He set them on the porch rail, 2 small moons that decided to belong to weather again. He slept in the chair by the door with the light over the sink left on because he was still old enough to do what his father had done and still young enough to want a reason for it. In the morning, his neighbor from across County 18 pulled into the drive with the casual angle of men who do not use turn signals because everybody already knows where they're going. Otho Vale had the kind of face that had learned to tolerate sunlight and other people's plans. He stepped out, looked toward the north field, then at the porch where the marbles caught the first slant. He paused. Thought I heard it last night, Otho said, as if they'd been in the same dream and had already agreed on the parts to keep. I didn't come. I was afraid if I went, I'd bring the wrong thing with me. You go. I went, Merritt said. He poured coffee into a cup that had chipped the day his daughter drove away, with her car full and her eyes wider than they had any right to be. He handed the cup down. There's a stone out there. You know it. Otho nodded. Been there longer than you and me combined. Some things are a door, and some things are the breath you take before you knock. They sat without sitting, Otho leaning on the post, Merritt half on, half off the iron chair that had belonged to his wife's aunt, and squeaked like the first word of gossip. The morning took the night apart and put it away neatly. The field did what fields do after an event. It pretended nothing had happened and invited you to harvest. By 10, the co-op truck rumbled up, the driver wearing the resigned cheer of a man who deals in averages for a living. Merritt walked the headland with him, pointed at moisture readings that lied slightly, agreed to pretend the numbers were written on a blackboard by someone with authority. He did the work. He did it until the work forgave him for wondering what else he might be supposed to do. That evening, he repaired the fence where the strand had been cut. He pulled it tight and stapled it with his grandfather's hammer because you use the tools that know your hands. He hammered in 3 staples and left one in his pocket so the fence would remember there is always one more job and it can't get cocky. He checked the pivot base out of courtesy to the machine. He replaced nothing. He spoke to no one. The sky went red behind weather stacked to the west, Kansas doing its job of sending clouds as if on purpose. For a week, the field behaved. The wind laid down its sheet music neatly. The coupe truck counted out grain like blessings. He slept at the proper times and did not wake to odd hours with the feeling of someone whistling at the edge of his life. The marbles stayed on the porch rail until a grackle knocked one off and it rolled into the peony bed and took up residence there like a kindness. The other slid into the pocket of his jacket and made friends with a nickel and a screw. On the ninth night, just after the 10 o'clock news told its last hurries, he heard the three notes again quiet, like acknowledgement, not summons. He walked out to the north edge and stood with his hands in his jacket, listening. The breeze had a bite, the first hard frost would be soon. He unlocked the gate at the lane and left it open for an hour, for no reason at all anyone else would endorse. He closed it again out of habit and walked back slowly, because a person should walk slowly sometimes or the land will feel cheap. He did not go back to the stone unless the sound asked, and it did not. He did, however, leave a small jar on the porch rail next to where the marbles had Saturday. It held nails, the good kind, old, with heads like pennies. Every day when he came home, he put one in his pocket, and every day when he went out after supper, he took one back to the fence line and put it in a coffee can under the scarecrow's torn shirt. Nobody told him to. He liked the weight exchange. He liked that fences need reminding and that the world is not improved by a man who ignores a slack line because his thoughts are more interesting. October reached both hands across the month and pulled. The trucks came and went. The harvest went well enough that he stopped thinking about what could have been if it had rained 4 more afternoons in August. He slept, he woke. The whistling did not return in any way that made him leave his chair. He began to tell himself he had imagined a portion of it, as a man will do when a thing does not ask for money or apologies. Near Halloween, his daughter called from Cedar Rapids, a night shift at the hospital, voice folded with fatigue and the kind of joy that remembers to leave room for the day. He told her about the fence and the harvest and the brakes squeal on the auger wagon that he had decided to live with until January. He did not tell her about the cellar. He would, maybe, when she brought the little boy down for Thanksgiving and they stood by the ditch and talked about frogs like a miracle. He would, maybe, if the field asked them both. In late November, after the last corn went into the bin and the bin talked in its sleep, the county put on its winter color. The field showed ribs, the ditch showed its honest bottom. The wind took one of the scarecrow's gloves, and Merritt did not replace it because some things are beautiful at half done. He walked every line of his ground one afternoon with the sun low and the temperature willing. At the fence, by the pivot circle, under the coffee can where he had been giving the fence its nails, he found a small thing. A train ticket for a child, maybe, not used. Edges scrolled by, damp and patience. The print read, Nevada to Ames, 2 bits. He turned it over. On the back, someone had written 3 notes the way some people know and others never will, little ovals marching up and down a ladder of lines. The ink had migrated slightly into the paper, the way memories do in older heads. He put the ticket in his pocket with the nickel and the screw and the marble that had refused the peony bed. He looked toward the stone without moving his face much, because a person does not want to give a field reason to brag. He said thank you into his jacket as if the cloth were a helper. He walked home. Winter did what it does. It scoured the county down to the essentials. It made the roads into suggestions and the kitchen into a chapel. It put the sound of the furnace into his bones and the number of snow shovels in the garage into a bigger argument than necessary. The whistling came once or twice in a blow that turned the mailbox into a hooded thing, and when it did, he stood at the window and let it be. The way you let a neighbor sing one verse of a song you only half like because he is your neighbor, and you hope the reverse is also true. When spring returned, hesitant and then reckless, he walked out to the stone once in daylight. He stood there like a person does when he's about to open a letter he has already read. He put his hand on the iron ring, and the ring chose not to move. He felt only cool metal and the idea of a door. He said the name of the boy he thought must have once practiced whistling there, not loud, not soft. He thanked the man with the Kessler tag for nothing and for everything. He went home and planted, because that is the part of the story a farm writes to remind itself the ending belongs to the ground and the beginning belongs to the same. If you ever hear 3 notes carry clean from a field at midnight, and you are the kind of person who can tell the difference between wind and a message, remember this. The first step into the rose is a promise. Don't make it if you intend to perform yourself for the dark. Bring only your boots, your breath, and your willingness to be the person who will go fetch, not the person who will tell about fetching. Don't shine your light straight into old places unless someone who belongs to them asks you to. Lay your hand flat on what needs closing. When a tune that has wandered too long finds its last note, let it. When a door that has been heavy learns again how to rest, do not hire that door for different work. There are states where cornfields wear their ghosts like belts. There are ditches whose water knows the names people set into it. There are stones that have been held down by weather and held up by stories. There are men who can whistle and men who cannot, and both kinds do well if they listen. And sometimes, in a county that owes as much to wind as to family, a man with a flashlight and an old dog asleep on the porch will follow a tune into the rose and come back, having left something that doesn't need his hands anymore. When he sits down again, the chair will squeak in the key the field prefers. The kitchen clock will softly argue with the refrigerator about seconds. The night will soften him on its slow wheel. The next day, someone will wave on County 18 without lifting a hand, and the answer will come back exactly right. And somewhere beyond the line where 2 quarters meet under a fence, a stone will find it easier to be a stone because 2 men lifted it once, together, and then set it down the way the land asked. He found a staircase in the lake it still goes up. He saw it when the wind fell off, and the lake lay down like glass. A sudden stillness that made every shoreline detail stand at attention. The afternoon sun had taken a step toward evening, yellowed and steady, and the north cove of Lake Lanier went calm enough to show the bones under it. He cut his aluminum skiff to idle and drifted toward the pale shoulder of exposed clay. There, not random at all, a run of stone steps pushed up from green water and kept going into nothing the shore could explain, even and true, as if they still believed a front door was waiting at the top. Before we begin, tell me where are you listening from and what time is it there? This was late September, 2022, after a summer of stingy rain and long afternoons when the heat felt like it had signed a lease. The lake sat northeast of Atlanta, a blue map of drowned hills and red clay coves, and that year it had read its gauge and decided to show some of what history had asked it to forget. Foundations revealed themselves like old teeth. The ghostly lanes of a 2-lane road slipped out of the murk and pointed nowhere. Between Bald Ridge and the mouth of 6 Mile Creek, a staircase announced itself and waited for a person with the right kind of attention to see it. Riven Kettering had that kind of attention. 38. A carpenter and part-time rescue diver who liked small engines and the honest work of making broken things carry weight again. He lived in a rental off Pilgrim Mill Road with a dog who had taught herself to sleep through sirens. He was not a romantic, not really. He was the kind of man who listened to what a hinge said when it wasn't being looked at. The lake had been a job and a solace for him since he moved down from the foothills of Tennessee a decade earlier, and on afternoons like this one, he took his old skiff out to idle over the drown. The staircase began 3 steps below the surface, pale rectangles set into the clay, then climbed above waterline, slick with algae, where yesterday had touched and left. 12 risers showed drop. They marched up the bank as if they had no intention of stopping, then continued past where stone ended, the air holding their measure with a confidence that made nothing in Riven's head feel quite steady. He nosed the skiff forward until its snub bow made a soft knock against the lowest dry riser. The hull and the stone talked for a second, low and hollow. He stood, keeping knees loose, eyes at a level where you can decide a thing without pretending it's not, pretending you first. The steps were fieldstone set into a poured bed, careful work from when hands were steadier because nothing had asked them to type yet. He could see where the mortar had let go, hairline by hairline, and where a leaf had chosen to become fossil rather than compost. He stepped out. The rock took his weight with a small, agreeable groan. He climbed, counting aloud the way you do when a rhythm wants to prove it's a law. 7, 8, 9. A wet line at his ankles where he had waded the shallow to push the skiff in. 10, 11, 12. He stopped where stone ended. The sidewalls rose one more course and then gave way to air. Ahead of him, nothing. Above him, more nothing. And yet his right foot, when he slid it forward with the caution of a man who had once fallen through a rotten porch and did not intend to audition for that pain again, found resistance. Not stone, not water. Not empty. A density like stretched cloth, like cold-pressed sugar, like a stare that remembered itself and refused to forget just because the lake had been told to be a lake. He drew his foot back, scalp prickling, breath in a pocket he didn't want to open too fast. He looked around to see if anyone else had been presented this joke. No one. In late September, a Tuesday can make a cove your private chapel. Far out, a pontoon boat moved like a floor with music on it. Closer in, a blue heron had made the stump of an old post into a claim. Riven set his palm above the end of the stone into the air where a banister would be if someone had finished the thought. He felt nothing until he pushed a hair past what he thought was safe. Then he felt a boundary, the exact height of a handrail in a code book he could recite. He smiled despite the way his heart had decided to pick up the tempo. Something here hadn't drowned entirely. Something here had decided to keep going up. He does not scare fast, Riven. He is a man who has gotten into dark water at night, kindly, and come back calmer for it. But he respects a place with a memory. He went back down the 12 risers and climbed into the skiff and sat with his hand on the tiller and let the lake tell him if it wanted him to be braver than his grandmother would approve. The wind was a rumor now. On the far shore, a transformer hummed with the stale sweetness of electricity. He turned the motor off and drifted with his fingers brushing the gunwale and felt for the old current under the new. A loon called once out in the main channel, the syllable bending toward a kind of loneliness that doesn't need an audience. Riven looked back at the steps. The air above the 13th riser shimmered, a trick of light or a rule he hadn't been told yet. He swore softly in the old way that buys you permission to try again. He pulled the skiff onto the red bank, tied it off to a scar of root, and went back up the 12. He did what his hands knew to do. He turned a coin on its edge and rolled it along the last stone. When it tipped forward into air, it did not fall. It sat against nothing, as if pressed to a glass he could not see. He slid it forward with one finger and felt it drag over an edge. He slid his boot after it and met a tread that had weight. He put his full foot down and his bones agreed that physics had not been insulted, only invited to a different kind of party. He brought the other foot up. He stood on the 13th step of something that existed without confessing to the eye. He took one more. 14. He stopped. He is not a fool. He turned to look at the lake, which does not care if you find it holy or treacherous, so long as you understand which mood it is in. The cove held its breath. He stepped backward down the 2 air treads with a caution that felt like a prayer you say without agreeing you're saying it. He stood again on stone that had no arguments and breathed the kind of breath that renters of boats make when the motor coughs once and then forgives you. Lake Lanier carries stories the way clay carries footprints. Old towns lie under it, old churches, the ghost lanes of old Federal Road. People will tell you about a stalled truck on a fogged bridge and a handprint on the back window after, about divers who won't go down a second time because they looked through a school of crappie and saw a porch swing move. Some of that is what happens when humans leave water to be the keeper of their history. Some of that is people being lonely and needing their fear to wear a costume. Riven carried none of those stories in the silly way. He carried them the practical way. He knew people had been told their land would drown for the good of cities they would never see, and some of those people had said their names into the bank and put rocks one on another to make the land remember. He went home with the staircase in his notebook and in his knees. He did not say the shape of it to the bartender at the place on Brown's Bridge, who called everybody chief. He did not post a photo because the lake punishes people who turn it into spectacle. He slept badly and woke before his alarm and made coffee meaner than necessary and drove back with a coil of thin rope and a chalk box and the tape measure he used when perfection had to be part of the bill. Morning Lake, blue as breath. The skiff skittered over wind ruffles and slid into the cove willing. He tied a chalk line at the last stone and played it out up the air, marking nothing with blue dust that caught in nothing and hung there like a trick. He laughed once, quietly. He measured riser height with the tape and found consistency that would have made a county inspector nod. He tied a loop in the rope and lowered it down the near face of the steps. The loop sat against an invisible edge and held, not tight, not loose, as if politely told to wait. Half an hour went by that way. Numbers, angles. The carpenter in him building a drawing that would keep his fear inside its lines. When he finished, he sat with his back against the sidewall and let his head find the cool of stone that had learned shade. The world stepped closer. From somewhere he could not triangulate came a sound that reminded him of a bicycle bell rung just once. In politeness, he stood. The sound did not come again. He walked down the 12 and waited on the shoreline while the lake decided whether to ignore him or to grant him more. A woman called from the top of the red bank. Riven looked up. She was tall and rangy, mid-40s, wearing the kind of straw hat that makes a person look like they know how to move in weather. She carried a camera with a strap that had been repaired twice and a notebook bulging with the kind of paper that did not come out of printers. She introduced herself with a grin that answered questions he had not asked. Mara Clary. She ran a small outfit that mapped drowned towns and grave relocations for counties that cared to admit their forgetting. She had a copy of the Army Corps' old charts and a habit of showing up where the lake loaned the present to the past. "I've been told you've got steps," she said, "and that they keep going up." He wanted to ask who had been talking. He wanted not to have his name in a stranger's mouth. But she put her hand on the sidewall like a careful person says hello to an old horse, and the way her face took in what she saw made him feel less alone in his own seeing. He nodded. He told her his name and the number of air treads he'd let himself trust. She whistled low. "Lanier tells on itself every few years," she said, eyes on the shimmer above the 13th. "But I haven't seen it do this. Fieldstone, that would have been a front walk probably. Or the stairs to a porch. You can tell from the way these aren't as steep as church steps. And there would have been a dog who slept halfway up until someone came home at supper." "Everyone says that about any porch," he said, smiling despite himself. "Only because it keeps being true," she said, and laughed like a sound the cove had missed. They measured together, she took photos, he held a stick out over the air risers and watched the end bounce against nothing. They left offerings the old way. He peeled the paper off a peppermint and set it on the third stone step. She untied a strip of blue cloth from her hat and tied it to the root that held his skiff's rope. The lake, if it acknowledged that at all, did not show it. She opened her notebook to a page where she had copied in neat letters the names and dates of households taken when the valley was flooded in the early 1960s. 2 farms had sat on this spur, the Sumter place, the Jory place. Sumter had 5 children and a clean way with fence lines. Jory was famous for a Sunday table and a sour temperament the rest of the week. The county had cut checks and called it a necessity. The stairs could have been either family's. But on the sidewall, low near the 5th riser, they found a mark cut into mortar with a nail or a stubborn penknife. A letter. "Jay, you think Jory," she said. "Or June," he said. "Or Josephine. Or a boy who didn't get to grow into his handwriting rights, their first initial into any stone that isn't busy." The lake made a small sound against the hull, a shrug. They came back the next day, and the next after that. In the afternoons, teenagers on rental jet skis came doing grammar the water did not admire. In the mornings, a heron watched like a magistrate. Once, a man in a bass boat cut his engine and drifted nearer and asked if the invisible was real or a trick. And when Riven told him the truth, he raised his cap and said, "Well then," and idled away because some facts want to be left alone to keep being facts. On the 5th day, just after noon, when the light loses some of its slant and the lake starts its long exhale toward evening, the air changed. Riven was on the 14th invisible tread, Mara two below on stone, the rope tied at his ankle as if that kind of thing would help. He felt a pressure move across his shin like a child's study of a newel post. The hair on his forearms declared a vote. He looked up. Above him, a faint dark line hung in the bright. A lintel, if you wanted to pretend to see one. A line where a door might have decided to sit if it still meant to. He lifted his hand slowly and let it hover. It met resistance at the height where a latch would be if people had followed the same measurements here as they did in town. He pressed a fraction and felt the air give. Not much, not enough to invite him, only enough to say, "I know what you are asking for," and no. He withdrew his hand. He did not try again. He went back down and sat on the 6th stone step and put his elbows on his knees and let his head go heavy in the way of a man who knows the difference between a closed door and an answer. "Not today," Mara said, not unkindly. "Doesn't mean never." A storm ran around the rim of the lake that night and forgot how to come down. The next morning broke clean and noisy, with birds relieved to be right about the Sunday. When they returned to the steps, the peppermint was gone. The strip of cloth whispered against the root when the wind remembered it. On the 4th stone riser, a line had been drawn in the red dust by a finger that had not belonged to wind. 4 short lines, 1 long. The way a person keeps track of days when they are doing a job no one else is counting, they looked at each other like people who have been included in a conversation without earning it. Mara wrote down the marks in that tidy, practical hand. Riven climbed to 14 again and did not press the air where the latch would be. He listened instead. It is an old trick. The more you don't demand to hear, the more willing a place is to say its piece. Somewhere above him, at the end of the invisible run, a sound came faint, almost an opinion. The scrape of a chair, foot against a wooden floor. Once, then a breath, remarkably ordinary, let out by someone who was done with a small effort and is pleased to have finished. He let his knees bend and went back down step by careful step. The county put out a notice, polite as a church lady, asking people not to climb anything that felt like absence. A man from the Corps came by with a clipboard and a caution that did not include humor and told them to rope the place from the bank. They tied a line and left it slack enough to be ignored by whatever needed to come and go. Mara logged coordinates and photographs and the exact color of the lichens on the sidewall. Riven made a drawing of the steps that showed the air ones the way you show trust, with dotted lines and a note that says, "As found." Word spread anyway. It always does when to leave a thing alone would be the more complicated form of love. A grandmother came and watched from the shade and told her granddaughter a story about the summer her brother rode a bike into a field that is now part of the lake and fell and did not cry, because corn leaves will cut you if you give them. An audience. A man in a Braves cap stood for a long time with his hands in the back pockets of his jeans and didn't tell anyone why his eyes kept the gloss they kept. A boy clapped once and apologized, and then asked if the staircase sounded like anything, and when Riven told him about the scrape and the breath, the boy looked toward the place where a door might be and whispered, "Thank you," like a student to a teacher who has handed out permission slips to freedom. On a Wednesday morning in early October, the lake rose 2 inches. The first stone step went green again. The 12th stayed dry. Riven set his palm to the sidewall as he had begun to do without design and said the names of the months out loud as if they were a key. Mara arrived late, hair in a bandana printed with little cranes, a thermos in one hand and a sheet of onion skin paper in the other, the thin kind that takes pencil and lets the stone's texture come up through. She rubbed the J, the nail-cut letter, and the tally marks. When she lifted the paper, the letter and the lines looked like a message written by someone whose words had to be rationed. She tucked the rubbing into her notebook with a care Riven recognized as kin to prayer. By noon, clouds built into a boast. Mara packed her camera because electric things deserve not to be insulted by weather. Riven untied the rope at his ankle and coiled it with the absent-minded competence of someone who likes ropes for the way they make order out of risk. The air above the 14th step felt different, cooler somehow, denser. He looked up and wanted more than he would have admitted the week before to see something acknowledge him. Not a face, not a figure, an idea. The lake refused. It kept to its rights. Before the storm broke, a small group arrived in silence. Not tourists, not thrill seekers, people in good shoes that did not belong to docks. A woman in a navy blazer, a man whose tie had been loosened by degrees and had stopped at 3, an older woman with a cane that looked like it had been carved by someone who understood trees better than money. They stood on the bank above the line and watched the steps like people watching someone figure skate after having once skated the same routine 3 decades ago and remembering what the body used to hold. The older woman spoke first, to the stone, not to the living. "You kept it," she said. "You stubborn thing. I told them you would." She introduced herself when Riven climbed down to the bank with his curiosity plainly showing. Ada Sumter Jory. Not a marriage, she was quick to clarify, but a habit of names borrowed and kept. Her father had been a Sumter, her mother a Jory by necessity and grievance. She had been 10 when the men from the government came and put stakes on the hill and told her they were measuring to make the river useful. She had been 14 when the kitchen was dismantled and stored in a relative's shed, and the porch chairs were put on a truck without the porch. She had been 15 when the lake finally climbed to the 7th stair, and the dogs refused to sleep where they had always slept, and had to learn ground new as a dollar. "My granddaddy set those stones," she said, chin lifting toward the steps. He knew the grade by eye. House stood there. She pointed at the air, ran long that way. Kitchen at the back, where mornings were honest. Stairs to the sleeping rooms tucked in right of the door. He told me we build stairs for coming and going and for waiting. That last part is where the world gets the math wrong. She cleared her throat once, a small thing that meant a larger thing had moved through it. "My brother wrote his letter J in the mortar before it set," she said, and smiled fully for the first time. He was 5 and mad because he had not been allowed to carry a stone and needed to have done something the porch would remember. They watched the lake together as it considered which forenoon belonged to which afternoon. Mara showed Ada the rubbing, and Ada put her palm on the paper like a hand over a baby's sleeping flank. "He stayed mean," she said of Jory, but without any real heat. But he loved that stare. Sat halfway up when he had nothing to do and the weather had nothing to argue about. Played that little bell you keep hearing because he liked the neatness of a sound that stops when you take your finger off it. The storm arrived, they covered what needed covering, the skiff rocked and complained, and then remembered it had been in worse moods and calmed. The rain washed the red dust off the risers and gave them back their gray. The air cooled like a head turning on a pillow to the comfortable side. Ada walked down to the 2nd step and touched it like the forehead of a child with a fever breaking. "Enough," she said to the rain, to the year, to the air that had learned to hold treads. In the weeks that followed, the staircase did what durable things do when they decide to belong to more than one story. It kept being itself. The lake rose and smudged the lower steps and then pulled back like a long breath returned. Riven kept coming because he had begun to like the feeling of leaving a place better than he found it by doing nothing but listening the way a well-made chair listens when a tired person sits. Mara wrote a piece for the County Historical Society that began with the sentence, "There are places we drown and places that refuse." Ada came twice more and told the stair her brother's best and worst. And once, on a bright Sunday, when the buzz of outboards sounded like cicadas pretending to be important, she brought a tin of biscuits and left one on the 3rd step because her mother would have called it manners. On a morning in November, the air thin and brisk, frost like pale sugar on shaded clay, Riven came alone. The lake had taken back an inch, the first 2 steps glowed green. He stood at the foot and waited the way you learn to wait when you've been given more than you asked and are smart enough not to get greedy. The wind came off the water and put its fingers through his hair with a familiarity he hadn't earned. Above the 14th tread, the line where a lintel would be shivered and then settled. He put his hand out at the height of a latch and did not press. "Thank you," he said to nothing and to something. He went home and made lunch and fixed a neighbor's sagging cabinet and walked his dog in the long honey of 4 o'clock. He slept that night without the lake climbing the stairs of his thoughts. He dreamed he was sanding a handrail he could not see, and woke with the particular ache in his forearm that tells a man he did a good day's work in the world that matters and the one that does not need him but lets him in anyway. If you go out to Lake Lanier on a fall day after a long dry, when the wind has the courtesy to lie down and let the surface polish itself, you can find the cove if you know who to ask and you promise out loud not to bring a ladder. The staircase will be there, stepping up from water into air with the patience of a body that has learned not to argue with time. You can put your boot on the 12th stone and your breath on your rib cage and decide if you will push your foot forward into the space where the 13th waits. If you do, it will hold. Not because wonder owes you, but because someone set a measure here with care, and because sometimes the world keeps an old promise in a new element. Say the year out loud when you find it. 2022. Say the place by its names. Lanier and the valley it drowned. Say the people if you know them. Sumter. Jory. Say the letter on the wall. J. Say the noise a bicycle bell makes when a brother likes attention and the porch has all afternoon. If you leave something, make it small. A ribbon, a peppermint, a finger laid gently in dust to make a line that will blow away with the next weather. Walk back down, let your knees do what they were built to do. Put your hand on the sidewall the way you would on a friend's shoulder when leaving them on their own porch in the dark to listen to the crickets. The staircase will keep going up whether or not your eyes can follow it. It will keep its measure in the air. The lake will rise and cover the lower treads and then fall back and confess again. Boats will hum. Herons will judge. A woman in a straw hat will rub letters onto paper, and a man with a dog who sleeps through sirens will coil rope and listen. And somewhere under the calm skin of the cove, where red clay holds onto everything it can hold, a front door you cannot see will stay shut and not unkindly, practicing the hardest kind of hospitality there is, offering you a way to ascend and a way to wait, and trusting you to know which one belongs to you today.